Welcome to another class 2 of the web design course by EduStart. I am your instructor, Kubiat Morgan. For today, we actually have just for this class. So we'll try to make it as fast as possible. As well, what I will do is, if you have questions, I'm just going to brush through the content that we have for this class, and then this video is going to be recorded and will be shared on the platform on the EduStart platform. So any follow-up questions that you would have would address it on the platform there. So yeah, as usual, you just keep your mic mute. If you have any questions, you just leave it on the chat and then we'll respond to it as we go. Let's get into what we have for today. Okay, good. So following up on our last class, we discussed about HTML in general. And basically, this diagram shows everything we talked about roughly, and the things that we're going to talk about in HTML, concerning HTML rather. So we said that this is a top-down overview of HTML, right? That HTML is composed of what elements, and these elements can be modified or can be defined by attributes. So like that is the entire HTML, right? That is basically everything you need to know in HTML. Right, so we talked about HTML itself as a language. In last class, we talked about the internet and a couple of things. Yeah, while we're going, we'll just get on with what we have, and then we can reference what we discussed in the last class as we go ahead. Right, so right now we are here. We talked about elements, right? Element as being the key thing that is basically what HTML is built on. And then we also explored the anatomy of an HTML element. We said it looks something like this, right? With the open tag, the tag name, the content, and the closing tag, right? And then we talked about exceptions to the structure, this particular anatomy that we put up, right? And we call those elements self-closing elements. In your project, I saw most of you used a couple of self-closing elements. So we'll just talk about that briefly and then move on to HTML attributes, right? So like I said, we are here, elements, and yeah, this is what a self-closing element looks like, right? Essentially, a self-closing element doesn't have a closing tag. Also, because there is no closing tag, it cannot enclose a content, right? So it has other ways it can define its own content, right? And that is when we start talking about attributes. But then essentially a self-closing tag does not have, right? A self-closing element does not have a closing tag. So what we see here is just what an open tag. And thank God for HTML5. As at HTML4, we would have to be writing a self-closing tag with this, a self-closing element with this slash, right? But in HTML5, we don't have to stress ourselves with that. And we can just write the self-closing elements like this. Some examples of the self-closing elements, like we can see, like we would also explore, would be the image elements. It's a self-closing element. It doesn't have a closing tag. And it's very important that you know these self-closing elements. Like they are not so much of them. They are not so many. So it's very easy to just know which one, right, is a self-closing element. Line break, the line break element, which uses the BR tag, is also this. I saw most of you use that for spacing as well. Yeah, that was very clever. Horizontal line elements, which uses the HR tag. The assets link element, or the link element, basically, which uses the link tag, and the input elements, the form input elements, which uses the input tag, right? So yeah, I still have to link to the cheat sheets, just like in last class. So you can explore that to just get a view of every single HTML element you could probably think of. And their uses and the attributes and things like that. So moving on, we are now going to talk about HTML attributes. Very, very important parts of HTML. Now, I would ask, what's the difference between these two shapes? Like, first of all, what shape are we looking at here? Then what do you think the difference between these two shapes are? Okay, they are both circles, and the difference is the color. So that's from Harold. So you are absolutely right. Other has a green color. And what I want to point out here is the color itself, the color we're talking about, you know, of that shape, what we were using to differentiate both of the shapes or define both of the shapes was an attribute. The color itself is an attribute, while the either it being blue or being green is the value. So we can see how just by changing, just using a single attribute and changing the values of those attributes, we can differentiate two separate elements, right? In this case, two shapes. So one, both of them being circles, obviously, and one being blue color and the other being green. So this essentially is what HTML attributes are. They only just define what? They define the attributes, basically. They define the elements itself. So they can also give more meaning. Like basically, if you want to morph an element, if you want to, you have a single div element, you want to make it look like something else, what you're most likely going to use would be attributes. Most of your interactions with HTML, right, is going to be attributes, right? So that is that. And here we see what the anatomy of an HTML attribute looks like, right? So I don't have to go over tag name again because that is an element. This is just a snippet or an excerpt of the HTML element itself, where we would naturally have the open tag, you know, the content, and then close tag, right? But this particular HTML attribute is specifying an explicit value. We have HTML attributes that don't explicitly don't specify a value. So in this case, we see that after the tag name, there is a space here, right? Because if you eliminate this space, basically you will just be your compiler or your text editor or your browser would assume that you're trying to, it will assume that whole text is your tag name, right? So very important, you separate, there's a space between the tag name and where the attribute starts, right? So you have the attribute name, and then you have you have an equal to sign, you have double quotes, and then you have the attribute's value, right? So this is how to specify an explicit value for an attribute, right? Then as we move on, we also have the anatomy of an HTML attribute that has an implicit value. This HTML attribute, for instance, now you see that this is what it looks like. There is no equal to sign and then, double quotes, but then it's still an attribute because it is implicitly specifying, a value. Right now, this is mostly possible when we got into HTML5. In HTML4, you would explicitly have to specify a value, and what you would do is attributes like this mostly would have the same. The value name is always the same as the attribute name, right? So when we get into practice, we're going to see what that looks like. Okay, so now we look at quick facts about these HTML attributes, right? HTML attributes define an HTML element. Also, they actually also modify an HTML element. They exist only on the open tag. In fact, I have to really stress this because it is very important that you understand that you cannot find HTML attributes in any other part of your HTML code other than the open tag of an HTML element, right? So if you find yourself writing HTML attributes as content, you're wrong. If you find yourself writing an HTML attributes in the closing tag of an HTML attribute, you're wrong. If you find yourself writing an HTML tag, an HTML attributes in, you know, basically any other place other than the open tag of an HTML element, then what you're writing is not an HTML attribute. So also, HTML attributes may or may not specify a value, right? Like explicitly. So that's what we start talking about, like explicit or implicit values. But in practice, it looks a lot easier. So yeah. Now, some elements also cannot function without certain attributes. There are some elements that, you know, if those attributes don't exist for that element, then, you know, it cannot function. It cannot, and it cannot do what it's supposed to do. So at this juncture, I'm going to, you know, take you back a bit to the example we had concerning the shapes. Now, look at these two shapes, right? The only reason you're able to call them a circle is because it has what? A circumference, right? Like that property, you know, that attribute is what defines the circle, right? If what you were seeing here were straight edges, you cannot call it a circle, right? So in that same vein, there are some attributes that are vital to describing what an element is, right? At that point in time, you know, and yeah, we'll look at some of those attributes. So what I'm going to do is, like I said, I'm just going to run down through our slide content and what we have, and then we'll dive into the code. Today would be, I told you we'll be working on the Google project together. So we'll start our Google project and see how we can make use of, you know, certain HTML elements and talk about HTML attributes as we go on. So let's proceed, right? So like I said, that's the last point I made there, that some elements cannot function without certain attributes. Example of those kind of elements are the image elements, right? Without the source attributes, you know, on the image element is useless, right? In fact, we're going to see what that looks like very soon. I'm going to just demonstrate that quickly. Also, we have the anchor elements, right, which is the A tag and the href attributes. Without the href attributes, the anchor tag cannot perform its function, like it cannot do what it's supposed to do, right? And the anchor tag is, the anchor element is the elements that you use to link resources together, right? You use to link resources. For instance, let's go to you know, reference site, google.com, right? Now the anchor tag, all this right here, all this right here are anchor tags, right? They link to another, they link documents together. If you're going to link a resource like a music file, you know, to your site such that someone can download it or can, you know, head towards that particular direction. Basically, they are called hyperlinks. So anchor tags are used to create hyperlinks. Now, this particular link now, you know, links to a particular part of Google in English or in Hausa. You can have, you know, this, you can, for instance, now the hyperlinks here will take you to another page. So all these are made possible. All these are made possible using, right, the anchor tag. So if the anchor tag does not have the href value, this would be impossible for HTML, right? It's going to be impossible for you to tell it to link to a particular this thing, like, oh, this is happening right now. So yes, I hope that is quite clear. If you have questions, please, you know, drop them in the chats and then I'll respond to them as we go. So now we'll look at a couple of HTML attributes examples, right? So we talked about the href. Href is used to point to a resource, right? Good. Okay. Harold is asking, what is href? What's the full meaning of href? Okay. The full meaning of href is hyper reference, right? The full meaning of href is hyper reference. That's why, remember HTML in its core, HTML means hypertext markup language, right? Which means which means and your website basically, since your HTML is used to write a web page, it's used to build your web page, and the website is a collection of web pages, right? The link that is done between those web pages, like to tie those web pages together to form a website, those links are called hyperlinks, right? And that's why the href attribute is what is used to create that link between to create that hyperlink between pages, between different HTML documents, right? So it's used to the href as an attribute, right? The href as an attribute is used to point to a resource. It could be document, it could be a HTML document, it could be a media document, media, it could be, music or anything. Now, it could be a script, it could be a style sheet. The elements that use href is the anchor element and the link element. The anchor element uses href to point to other, like to link, to create hyperlinks, to link different web pages together, right? While the link element uses the href to link your HTML documents with things like, your your icons, right? Or your style sheets, okay? So that is href. The source attributes, which is denoted by src, is used to embed a script or media into a HTML document. So if the elements that use it is the image element, the audio element, the video element, and even the script element, right? So if you wanted to embed an image on your HTML page, right, or your web page, you use the source attribute to specify the location of that image. Same thing with audio. If you want to embed an audio on your page, you would use the source attribute to specify the the location to that audio file or the video file, and so on and so forth. Then we have IDs and classes. Now, IDs, we'll talk about IDs and classes again when we enter CSS, right? But for now, just know that an ID is the attribute that is used to uniquely identify an element, right, on your web page for the purpose of either styling or interactivity. That is styling using CSS or interactivity using JavaScript. So like I said, we'll talk about that when we get into CSS more in depth. For now, one thing you should know is that as best practice, you should never give two elements the same ID, because IDs are meant to uniquely identify an element, right? We move on to class. Class is just the attribute that is used to group elements together for the same purpose that you use IDs for the purpose of either styling or interactivity, right? All elements that can be found inside the body tag, inside the body elements, can use either IDs or class, right? And I feel at this point I should point out that very importantly, you can stack elements. You can stack attributes. You can have multiple attributes on an element, right? Then we look at type. Type is an attribute that is used to specify, right, a single use case for an element that can be used for multiple functions. What this means is it's almost very straightforward, and it's quite interesting. There are some HTML elements, right, that can serve different purposes, right? Remember if you remember our definition of HTML, we described HTML as a language that defines the structure of a content, right? It defines what a content is to the browser, right? And it does that using what? Elements. So there are some elements that can actually define different use cases. For instance, a button can be used within a form to mean represent a submit action, right? a button can also be used standalone as just a normal button. It can also be used within a form to specify a reset action. These are things that would you can see in practice, or we're going to see in practice very soon. Now, also an input element, right? An input element can stand as a text box, as just a clear text box. It could stand as a checkbox. It could stand as a button also, right? As a summit button. It could stand as a radio button, It can serve different functions. So the type attribute is what you're going to use to specify how you are using, or what particular use case are you going to be using this input element as, right? Then just so that we can cover a couple of things, since we are going to start the Google project today, let's just look at briefly what the anatomy of the HTML form looks like. Yeah, and just talk about it a bit. So, right, an HTML form, a form in HTML is how you are going to most likely be collecting input from your user, accepting input from your user. Quickly, I'm just going to show you an example of a form on Google's page, just like we saw initially. So if you look at Google's homepage here, this field you are having here, this input field that you're having here, that you can easily type stuff in, right? So this input field that accepts the user's inputs is part of a form, right? A form is part of an HTML form, and a form is a way that you can take in inputs from the user, right? So it's very important to note that. So this is what that form looks like, right? And I'm just going to dissect this quickly. And like I said, it is in practice that this will get a whole lot clearer, right? Now, the HTML form has two major attributes: the method and the action. So if you can see that this looks exactly like the anatomy of the attributes that we talked about here, right? Then attributes would have like an attribute name, the name of the attributes, right? And then equal to, and then within quotes, you're going to have what's the value of that attribute. So that's the same thing you're seeing here. The name of this attribute is method, and the value that I'm giving it here right now is get. We have another attribute called action, and for now, the attribute is £. So, and then you have, this is what a comment looks like in HTML. I noticed a couple of people also used comments in their code for the last project. So this is what a comment looks like in HTML. And the idea of comments is, comments are just used to document your code. You can talk about your code in comments, and it only communicates to the developers, right? Or the coders. It doesn't exactly communicate to your browser. In fact, when your browser, when your browser comes across a comment, it ignores it. It doesn't, it doesn't think of how to render it or how to display it to the user. It does not, it's not always visible to the user, right? So it ignores it completely. So we use it in programming we use comments in programming to document our code, to talk to developers, like, and then, basically talk about your code and what parts or what your code is doing at that point in time. So, and then you have a sample input element. Now you see that an input element is a self-closing element because there is no closing tag, right? And then it has this particular input element has two attributes. One is a type. And remember, I said the type attribute specifies the use case of that particular element at that point. So this type is, the value of this type is submit, which is stating that this input element right now is acting as a submit button, right? And then the value, every form element, every single form element that you can think of, right, has a value, either explicitly or implicitly, right? And for now, the value of this is submit. So these are some of the HTML attributes and what I just explained. Now, the one of the HTML attributes that you'll come across is name, right? The name attributes, right, is used to specify the identity of a form, of a form input, right? When it gets to its destination. This particular attribute you're seeing here, method, right, specifies how that form, you know, how the form is going to be submitted. How is it going to get to its destination? What is the method it's going to use? And there are only two options that that particular method or that particular attribute can carry. There are only two values. One is get and one is post. And yeah, we would also talk about that, you know, to make it a little bit clearer. Form is usually a bit fuzzy for first timers. So just follow me as I'm going along. Action attributes specifies where the form is going to be submitted to, right? So think of it this way. If you were given a bank form to fill, for instance, right? This whole form element is that bank form, right? And then on that bank form, let me say it was a account creation form. Now you fill in, depends, you see a lot of fields on the form. You can see fields like, you know, text boxes where you can write your name. You see fields like check boxes where they'll tell you maybe check whether you're male or female, and you have to check that. You could see fields that would ask you to put in your phone number, your address, and all those things, right? So those are form elements, right? And then on the form, you can see something like an address where you can post that form to, where you're going to submit that form to. That address is the action, is specified by the action attribute. That is the destination of the form. That is where you submit the form to after you're done, right? For validation or whatever the form is supposed to be used for. Now, how are you going to, if that's, you know, now the method, right, now specifies how are you now going to get the form, you know, to that particular destination. Are you going to carry it in your hands, you know, put it in an envelope, you know, are you going to put it in the form in an envelope, seal it, and then deliver it to the address? Or are you just going to carry the form the way it is, you know, empty, you know, just carry the form just the way you filled it and then just go and submit it, right? So you notice that for more sensitive forms, right, for more sensitive forms, you don't, you have to enclose it, right? You have to enclose that form. If you liken that to HTML, that method type is post, right? You can see that here. The method is used to specify how the values of the form should be sent to its destination, right? Values is, you can have get or post. So post means you conceal the values of the form, right? So that they are not visible to the end user, right? And then get means you can expose the values of the form so they are not visible to the end user, right? So this is still a lot to talk about. I would want us to just quickly, since we're kind of running out of time, so I want us to just quickly look at a quick demonstration of our Google project, so, and see how far we can go with that. So yeah, now I'm going to start here. This is my folder. This was a document for the last lesson, right? So this is a folder I just created. I created a folder called Google. And for every project that you're going to ever work with, the first thing you would do is to create a file called index.html. Why index.html? Because when a server makes a request, remember we talked about client-server architecture. When a server makes a request for your website, the very first file, the file that the server is expecting, or sorry, the client is the server now is expecting to see as the home page, is expecting to see a file called index.html as your home page, right? So quite important that you name, you name your home page index.html. And then just like how we talked about the HTML structure, so we have head, we have title, and then we specify what's in the title. This time we're going to specify Google because we are trying to work on our Google page. Then the body tag is where every other thing goes into. So if you can see, this is just the basic structure for our HTML structure, right? So we are going to, like, first thing I'm just going to do is just show us how to embed an image into this site. And that is going to be using the image elements and then the source attributes. In this case, I already have an image inside the same folder, right? My same Google folder. I created a folder called assets. And inside that asset, I created a folder called images. And then I have my, you know, the name of my email, my image, and the extension there. So I'm just going to save this quickly and then launch this so that we see what it looks like. Now you can see my homepage, and then you can see the image that I put up on that page, right? So this is how you can embed an image on your site. Now, remember we talked about image and source and it's being the most important thing. If I take out this source attribute and leave this image tag like this, and then I go back to my site, you can see that we cannot see any image again on that web page. That is because the source attribute is very important to the image element, as it is used to specify the location of the image that you're trying to import into your website, right? So I can put that there, and then I can quickly, you know, set up a form element for our search bar for our Google page, right? Now, for now, I'm going to put this method as get, and then I'm going to put the action as, you know, a pound sign. Pound sign is when you're trying to specify no action at the time, right? Which means if the browser comes across that, the browser is going to, the browser is not going to take the form to anywhere. It's just going to, it's basically just specifying a dead link, so to speak. So the form attributes, and then now we have the form elements, just as we defined before. And then we are going to create an input, right? And we are going to call there. Now, if you're using VS Code, you know, like I recommended, you know, as a beginner, just download VS Code as your text editor and get to use. VS Code does code suggestions for you. So you can see what the possible values for an attribute can be, you know, for attributes that have fixed values. So for instance, like the method attributes, where once you put this, you can see that there are 3 options, you understand? Though we talked about 2 major options that we can have for the method. For post, that's get and post, right? And then we selected get. If you're using VS Code, you would have that luxury, okay? So for the input type, now we specify, if you put in your double quotes, right, you will notice that you have difference. In fact, you know, your inputs can function as a button, a checkbox, you know, color picker, a date picker, a date time picker, an email field, excuse me, a file picker. It can, you know, function as an image picker, months, all these are still date pickers anyways, as a number field, as a password field. You know, a password field would be, you know, the values would be concealed, so you cannot read what the person is typing when the person is typing it. So a radio field, these are like radio buttons. A range field resets. There are a ton of things that you your input field can function as, and the type attributes is what you use to specify which particular, you know, use case of the input elements you are looking for at that point in time. So for this point in time, we are looking for the search, right? And then if we save this quickly and just take a look at our page currently now, you can observe that there is a text box that is already showing up here, right? So you can observe that there's a text box that is already showing up here, which means that we've successfully added an input to that, an input element to our site. So yes, this does not look like, you know, this definitely doesn't look like Google in any way. You know, it doesn't even go halfway to look like what we would have normally in Google here. But remember that our focus for these Google projects right now is to make use of the right HTML elements as we go. So there are a couple of things I could proceed with adding just one link, this Gmail link, just so that we can see what that looks like. If I was going to add that link is above my image elements. So I come up here and I'm using the anchor tag, sorry, the anchor element, which is represented by the A tag, right, to add my link. And remember, I said that href is a very important attribute of your anchor tag, as it specifies where the anchor tag should take you to when you click on it. So for now, I'm just going to put £, which basically just represents a dead link. I don't want it to take me anywhere for now, right? And then the anchor tag is not a self-closing element. So the content is specified within the open and the closing tags. So in this case, I'm going to call this Gmail. And then let's see what this looks like. So let's see what this looks like quickly. So you can see there, right? Gmail shows up, and if we click this, see what happens on our browser. The hash sign shows up. It does not take us anywhere. That's because we specified what's a dead link, right? So I know we're very fast with what we've been doing so far, but if you have any questions, please let's all converge at the EduStart platform. I'll be there to answer all your questions all through the week, and then we can get to working on this more. That's working on our Google projects more often. And thank you for being a part of this class.